Hi, this is Teacher Ryan, and today we're going to talk about the three types of ornaments that are generally used in violin and how we can kind of play them a little bit easier and more professional sounding. What are ornaments? Not the kind of stuff you put on trees for this particular application. This is going to be stuff like grace notes, trills, and turns. So what those sound like, a grace note is something that sounds like a quick flick of the finger into a singular note. A trill is probably one that a lot of people are familiar with if they've heard maybe some Vivaldi songs, and it's because it's that kind of bird chirping sort of sound. And that can be extended as long as you need. And then the other type that I was talking about is the turn, which is, I'm Irish, it's used in a lot of Irish songs and other ones too, but it's where you play the note, the note above, the note again, and then the note below, and back to the note. And ornaments, importantly, this is true for all ornaments, no matter what the tempo is that you're playing, you need to play them as quickly as possible because they're not supposed to really take up any time during the measure. You'll notice that most of these are like very small written notes. So like, for example, grace notes, they look like tiny little notes with a slash through them, and that's because they're not really supposed to affect where the beat is happening. So if a measure is in 4/4 time signature and you have 4 quarter notes in the measure, you could technically have a grace note in between the first two, or you could have 2 grace notes in between the first two, or 3. But all of those notes are supposed to be so quick with how you place your fingers and effectively play fast that they don't take up any more time than they should. Sometimes you have to cut a little bit into the upcoming note, but you always want to make sure that you're on that beat because for the most part, unless you're playing jazz, which that can kind of change things. But speaking from like a classical perspective. So how do we play? Let's start with grace notes. So an easy way to like kind of get used to this idea is you have to think of it as timing. So when I move my bow, starting the bow movement, I have to delay my finger movement off of the string for just the tiniest split second, okay? So in slow motion, I start the bow, and then I flick the finger off as the bow keeps moving. A lot of people, when they're first trying this, they'll end up moving their left-hand finger so quickly that they don't even hear the actual note that's supposed to be the grace note, which in this case is our second finger. You want to have a sense of really good timing here with how your bow is moving. A lot of the time we don't have to think about our bow so much when we're learning difficult things in songs, especially, difficult left-hand fingerings. But for this case, you definitely want to be thinking about your bow. So I would say practice, like definitely hearing the note, like intentionally, and then starting to pick up the pace until you can barely hear any difference between the startup time of the bow and the actual note. So just a quick delay. So the second type of ornament that we were talking about today, the trill. For this one, I'm going to talk a little bit about how to move your fingers. This can also apply for the grace note. The grace note, if you want to think of it this way, is kind of like a singular trill. Now, there can be more than one grace note, in which case, it's a bunch of different fingers used, but the trill is typically the note and then the note above it based on the key. So if we were doing that same thing from B to C natural, you can do something like that. Now, how am I moving my finger there? So I'm lightly pressing this second finger over and over and over again, almost like I'm kind of like just tapping my finger on the table, like very quickly, like I'm impatient or something. But importantly, I'm not pressing all the way down like I normally would for putting a finger down. In this case, I'm just pressing enough to where I have a little bit of a bounce off of the metal. So you'll see, like, if you look very closely when you're doing this at your finger, you'll see the metal actually of the string going down just a little bit every time, but you're never going to actually fully touch the fingerboard. You're not slamming that finger down to be like a concrete finger here. You want it to be as light and quick as possible so that you don't have to be like placing, taking off, placing, taking off. This is more like just dropping it enough to where you can take it off lightly. So, see how light that is? And you'll still hear the note. You'll still hear that C natural as I'm playing it. But it's light enough to where you can play it so quickly that you're really going to impress anybody who's wanting to hear a really nice solid trill. And you do want to do some fast trills like that when you're playing songs from Vivaldi, from Mozart. Mozart loves his trills, and some, of course, many others. But rarely are you going to want to do a very slow trill. That's usually only if you're like going to speed it up eventually anyway. All right, third and final one we're going to talk about today is the turn. So this is the most complicated sort of these because it's involving more than one note that you're having to do very quickly. So think of it as like wherever the bass note is. So let's say this is B natural is the bass note here. Remember, it's the note above, the note, and the note below, and then the note again. So like that. You're going to want to practice that first part only, then add in one note from that, almost like your grace note, right? And then you're going to add the A string, so the note below, until you can get really fast at that. Keeping in mind that mentality of the trill, where you're keeping these fingers kind of lighter as you're placing them down quickly. And then, of course, you add the final note after you've got really fast at that one. And you can do this on, of course, any finger. Important to note, how do you know if something is a trill or a turn? Because with a grace note, you see like the tiny little note, right? With the turn, you're going to see a symbol that kind of looks like a swirl on its side, but it's not complete. So it'll just look like that. And then for trill, you just see TR over a note usually, which will just mean you do that note and then the note above it based on the key. But those are just some quick tips for some three ornaments that are pretty common in violin. Thanks for watching. Bye.